On a family vacation, Marcus Jones, an undercover FBI agent, is racially profiled and wrongfully accused by local police. What they don't know is that Marcus has been quietly gathering evidence of their misconduct. As the tension mounts, Marcus prepares to reveal the officer's dangerous biases in a powerful and unexpected way. But will justice be served before it's too late? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. The sun shone brightly in the sky as the Jones family, packed into their car, pulled into the driveway of the cozy lakeside resort. Marcus, a tall and calm man in his mid-40s, was at the wheel, his eyes scanning the surroundings as they arrived at their destination. Tasha, his wife, sat beside him, gazing out at the shimmering lake in the distance, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had crept up on her since they entered this small, unfamiliar town. Their children, Ava and Eli, sat in the back seat, bubbling with excitement. For them, this trip was an adventure, time away from the city, away from the hectic lives their parents led, and a chance to reconnect as a family. Marcus had been working hard, too hard. As an undercover FBI agent, his work was dangerous, intense, and often led to him spending weeks, if not months, away from home. This vacation was supposed to be different, a chance for him to finally relax, to breathe, and to be present for his family. Tasha reached over and gently squeezed Marcus's hand. "I'm so glad we're finally doing this," she said softly, trying to convince herself that this vacation would be the break they all needed. "Me too," Marcus replied, giving her a reassuring smile. He glanced in the rearview mirror at Ava and Eli. "You two ready for some fun?" "Yeah." Ava, the older of the two, beamed. "I can't wait to swim in the lake." "Can we go fishing?" Eli asked, eyes wide with excitement. Marcus chuckled. "Of course, we'll do everything you want." But as they settled into their cabin and headed out to explore the nearby town, a strange tension began to creep in. It was subtle at first, a lingering stare from the shopkeeper when they entered a local convenience store, a couple on the sidewalk whispering to each other as they passed by. Tasha felt it first, the uneasy sensation of being out of place, of not being fully welcome. She glanced at Marcus, but he appeared focused, as if nothing unusual was happening. "Are you okay?" Tasha whispered, trying to keep her voice low, not wanting to alarm the kids. Marcus glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it's nothing. Let's just get what we need and head back to the cabin." As they made their way to the counter to pay for snacks and drinks, the clerk's eyes lingered on them for a little too long. He didn't smile, didn't offer any friendly greeting. Instead, he stood there, watching, his fingers tapping the counter impatiently as Marcus reached for his wallet. "What's going on?" Tasha asked in a hushed voice, her nerves growing as the uncomfortable silence stretched. Marcus handed over the cash and met the clerk's gaze. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The clerk hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "No," he muttered, bagging their items with deliberate slowness. "Just haven't seen you folks around here before. You on vacation?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He could feel the tension building, but he didn't want to make a scene in front of his family. "Yeah," he finally said. "Just here to enjoy some time with my wife and kids." The clerk's eyes flicked between Marcus and Tasha, then to the children. His lips pressed into a thin line as if he wanted to say something but held back. Marcus took the bag and turned to leave, motioning for his family to follow. As they stepped outside, Tasha exhaled, relieved to be out of the suffocating atmosphere of the store. But her relief was short-lived. As they walked towards their car, a police cruiser pulled up beside them, its lights flashing briefly before the siren was cut off. Marcus tensed. He instinctively moved in front of Tasha and the kids, shielding them with his body as two officers exited the vehicle and approached them. "Excuse me, folks," one of the officers said, his voice sharp and authoritative. "We're going to need to ask you a few questions." Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken, though his face remained calm. "About what?" he asked, his tone measured. The second officer, who stood slightly behind his partner, stared at Marcus as if sizing him up. "We received a report about a family matching your description. There's been some thefts in the area recently. Mind showing us some identification?" Tasha stiffened beside him, and Marcus could feel her fear radiating off her. The kids, sensing the sudden change in the atmosphere, went quiet, their earlier excitement draining away. "We're just here on vacation," Marcus said evenly, though he could feel a rising anger inside him. "I'm not sure what this is about, but we don't know anything about any thefts." "Just standard procedure," the first officer said, though his eyes were cold. "Let's not make this difficult. IDs now." Marcus hesitated for a split second. He could flash his FBI badge and end this right now, but something told him to wait. He didn't want to escalate things, didn't want to draw unnecessary attention. So, he calmly pulled out his driver's license and handed it over. Tasha did the same, her hand trembling slightly as she fished her wallet from her bag. The officer scrutinized the IDs for what felt like an eternity, then handed them back with a frown. "You folks staying here at the resort?" he asked, as if still not convinced. Marcus nodded. "Yes, we have a cabin here. Is there anything else?" The officer glanced at his partner, then back at Marcus. "Well, we'll be keeping an eye on things. Stay out of trouble." With that, the officers returned to their car and drove off, leaving the Jones family standing there, stunned. Tasha let out a shaky breath. "What just happened?" she whispered. Marcus looked down at his children, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. He knew exactly what had just happened, but he didn't want to scare them. "It's nothing," he said quietly, though the weight of the encounter settled heavily on his shoulders. "Let's just go back to the cabin." As they walked away, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The car ride back to the cabin was uncomfortably quiet. Ava and Eli sat in the back seat, their excitement from earlier completely drained, replaced by confusion and unease. Tasha stared out the window, her lips pressed tightly together. Marcus kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his jaw clenched, thinking over every detail of the encounter with the officers. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to them, but it never got easier. No matter how many times they tried to shake it off, these moments left a mark, a reminder of how they were seen, not as individuals, but as people to be suspicious of, simply because of how they looked. Marcus knew the kids didn't fully understand what had happened, but they were old enough to sense that something was wrong. When they arrived back at the cabin, Tasha broke the silence. "Marcus, what was that about? Why did they come after us like that?" Marcus turned off the car and took a deep breath before responding. "It's what we've dealt with before. Just bias." He didn't want to say more in front of the children, but Tasha knew exactly what he meant. They both tried to move on with their day, distracting themselves by heading down to the lake with Ava and Eli. The sun was still shining, the water was calm, and the sound of laughter from other families enjoying the day filled the air. It should have been peaceful, but the encounter earlier had left a shadow over them. Tasha sat on a blanket near the shore, watching the kids wade in the shallow water while Marcus stood nearby, keeping an eye on them. But neither of them could fully relax. Tasha could tell Marcus was still on edge, his eyes scanning the area as if expecting the officers to return. "What are you thinking?" Tasha asked softly when Marcus finally sat down beside her. Marcus looked out at the lake, his expression serious. "I'm thinking that those officers weren't just doing routine questioning. They saw us and made assumptions. No evidence. No reason. Just assumptions." He paused, rubbing his hands together. "I let it go for now, but something doesn't sit right with me." Tasha nodded. "I could feel it too. The way they looked at us, it wasn't just about routine questioning." Her voice was tight, filled with frustration. "It's like they were waiting for us to slip up, to confirm what they already thought." Marcus didn't reply immediately. Instead, he pulled his phone out of his pocket, checking the recording he'd discreetly started when the officers first approached them. Every word, every tone of suspicion was captured on that recording. He had learned long ago to stay prepared, especially in situations like these. As an FBI agent, he was trained to stay calm under pressure, to assess every situation with a level head. But this was different. This wasn't just about work. This was his family, his children, being dragged into a situation that was born out of prejudice. "You recorded it?" Tasha asked, leaning closer when she saw the phone in his hand. Marcus nodded. "I had to. I didn't want to escalate things then, but I'm not letting this slide. They think they can get away with this because they don't know who I am. Tasha frowned, worry creasing her forehead. You didn't show them your badge. I didn't want to, not then. I didn't want to use it as a shield in that moment. I needed to see how far they would take it if they thought we were just another family they could push around. Tasha let out a frustrated sigh. It's not right. I hate that you even have to think like that. I know, Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm. But that's the reality. We shouldn't have to live like this, but we do, and I won't let them walk away from this like it's nothing. For the next few hours, they tried to focus on enjoying the day. Marcus took Eli fishing, showing him how to cast the line, while Ava splashed around near the shore, giggling as Tasha snapped photos of her with her phone. The normalcy of these moments brought a temporary peace, but it was fragile, constantly overshadowed by what had happened. As evening settled in, they returned to the cabin. The children, worn out from the day's activities, fell asleep quickly, leaving Marcus and Tasha alone in the living room. The cabin was quiet, the only sound coming from the soft rustling of leaves outside the window. I don't think it's over, Tasha said quietly, breaking the silence. Those officers, the way they were acting, it was like they had already decided we were guilty of something. I'm scared, Marcus. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. I know, I feel it too, but I'm not going to let them intimidate us. I've dealt with worse. We'll get through this. But before he could say more, a loud knock came at the door, startling them both. Marcus shot Tasha a glance, motioning for her to stay back as he stood up and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, there were 2 officers standing outside, the same ones from earlier. But now their demeanor was different, less formal, more confrontational. We need to ask you a few more questions, the first officer said, his hand resting on the handle of his flashlight, which was looped on his belt. Marcus didn't budge. Is there a reason for this? We've already cooperated with your questioning earlier. The second officer, the quieter of the 2, stepped forward. We're investigating a string of thefts in this area. You and your family fit the description of suspects. Marcus's eyes narrowed. That's the second time you've said that. What exactly is this description you're working from? The officers exchanged a glance, clearly taken aback by his calm, direct challenge. The first officer cleared his throat. We're just following up. If you don't have anything to hide, you'll let us ask a few more questions. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He knew what they were doing, fishing for something, anything, to justify their treatment of him and his family earlier. But he wasn't going to let them push him around. I don't have anything to hide, Marcus said, his voice steady, but I don't appreciate being treated like a criminal based on nothing but your assumptions. If you don't have evidence, I suggest you move on. The officers bristled, clearly unprepared for Marcus's calm defiance. They had expected him to back down, to be intimidated. But Marcus wasn't backing down, not this time. The silence stretched between them for a few moments before the first officer finally spoke again, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. Just stay out of trouble, Mr. Jones. We'll be watching. With that, they turned and left. But the tension in the air remained. Marcus stood at the door for a moment, watching as their cruiser disappeared down the road, before closing it and turning back to Tasha. They're looking for something, he said quietly. But they're not going to find it here. Tasha nodded, her face pale. I don't like this, Marcus. I don't like any of it. Neither do I, he admitted. But I'm not going to let them get away with this. As he sat back down beside Tasha, he pulled out his phone and stared at the recording once more. He knew that this wasn't just about them. It was about the bigger picture, about how many other families had gone through the same thing, about how many more would face this if something didn't change. And Marcus was determined to be the one to make that change. The air in the cabin was thick with tension. Marcus sat at the dining table, his fingers tracing the edge of his phone as he replayed the interaction with the officers in his mind. Tasha paced quietly around the room, her nerves too jittery to allow her to sit still. It had been hours since the second confrontation, but the words "we'll be watching" echoed in both their minds like an unwelcome warning. They had done nothing wrong, yet they were being treated like suspects. The children were asleep, blissfully unaware of the situation that was slowly spiraling out of control. Marcus and Tasha had tried their best to shield them from the fear and confusion, but they both knew it couldn't last forever. "Marcus," Tasha said quietly, stopping in front of him, her eyes filled with worry. "What are we going to do? This feels like it's just getting worse." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know, but I'm not going to let this go unchecked. They're pushing us because they think they can. They're used to people backing down, not fighting back." "I don't want to fight," Tasha said, her voice tight. "I just want to enjoy this vacation and go back home without any more problems. Why can't they just leave us alone?" Marcus looked up at her, his expression serious. "Because to them, we're not just another family. They see us as something else, something suspicious. That's how this works, Tasha. We're guilty in their eyes until proven innocent." Tasha sat down across from him, shaking her head. "It's not right. We shouldn't have to deal with this. Not after everything we've been through. You're a federal agent, for crying out loud. That doesn't matter to them. All they see is what's on the surface," Marcus replied. He paused, his eyes dark with determination. "But they're not going to get away with this. I've been gathering evidence, and I'll make sure this doesn't just disappear." Tasha looked at him, her expression softening with a mix of admiration and fear. "I know you will. But I'm scared, Marcus. These officers, I don't trust them. I feel like they're waiting for any excuse to take this further." Marcus reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I won't let that happen. I promise you." The weight of his words hung in the air, but before they could say anything more, there was another knock at the door. Tasha's eyes widened in alarm, and Marcus immediately stood, moving toward the door with cautious steps. He glanced through the window before opening it, and when he did, his expression hardened. It wasn't the officers this time. It was the resort manager, a wiry man with a nervous smile plastered on his face. He stood there, shifting from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "Good evening, Mr. Jones," the manager began, his voice overly polite. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "What can I do for you?" Marcus asked, his tone neutral, but edged with suspicion. The manager cleared his throat, casting a quick glance over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone else was around. "I just wanted to check in with you and your family. I've heard there were some issues with the local law enforcement. I wanted to make sure everything's okay." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "How did you hear about that?" The manager gave a nervous chuckle. "Small town, Mr. Jones. Word travels fast. I just want to assure you that the resort values all our guests, and we hope this doesn't affect your stay." Marcus narrowed his eyes. There was something off about the way the manager was speaking, as if he were trying to distance the resort from the situation, to remain neutral in what was clearly a tense local matter. "We appreciate the concern," Marcus said carefully. "But we've had some pretty unpleasant encounters with the police since we arrived. They've been harassing us, and frankly, it's unacceptable." The manager nodded quickly, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "I understand completely. Believe me, this town, well, it has its ways. The officers around here, they're not used to, outsiders." He winced as the words left his mouth, clearly regretting his phrasing. "But please, if there's anything we can do to make your stay more comfortable, let us know." Marcus studied the man for a moment, weighing his words. He didn't trust him, not entirely, but there was no point in pushing the issue with him. The real problem was with the police, and that was where Marcus's focus needed to be. "Thank you," Marcus said finally. "We'll let you know if we need anything." The manager nodded again, his nervous smile returning. Of course. Have a good night." As soon as the door closed, Tasha let out a frustrated breath. They know. Everyone around here knows, and no one's doing anything about it. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "That's how it works in small towns like this. People look the other way because they don't want to get involved." Tasha stood up, pacing again. "But it's so wrong. They're treating us like criminals, Marcus, and now the resort manager is acting like it's just something we have to deal with." "I know," Marcus said quietly, "but I've dealt with this kind of thing before. These officers are bullies, plain and simple, and bullies like them think they're untouchable." Tasha stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes filled with worry. But what if they are untouchable? What if they decide to come back, and this time they don't leave so easily? Marcus's expression hardened. They're not untouchable. They just think they are because no one's challenged them. But I have the recordings, and I'm not letting this slide. I've worked too hard, seen too much to let a couple of small-town cops get away with this. Tasha bit her lip, clearly still anxious. I trust you, Marcus. I do. But I can't help feeling like we're walking on eggshells here. Like anything we do could set them off. Marcus walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. I won't let anything happen to us. I'll protect you and the kids. You know that. She nodded, resting her head against his chest. I know. I just hate that we have to live like this. I hate it too, Marcus whispered. But we're going to get through this, together. They stood like that for a few moments, finding solace in each other's presence. But deep down, Marcus knew the situation wasn't over. The officers had made it clear they were watching, and Marcus suspected they were waiting for the right moment to strike again. The next morning, they tried to resume their vacation. Marcus took the kids for a walk along the lakeshore, while Tasha stayed behind at the cabin to read and relax. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He scanned the area constantly, his senses heightened. As they made their way back toward the cabin, Marcus spotted something out of place. A parked police cruiser, a little too far down the road, its windows tinted so dark he couldn't see inside. His instincts kicked in immediately, the years of FBI training surging to the forefront of his mind. This wasn't coincidence. They were being followed, watched more closely than ever before. Later that afternoon, the tension mounted. Marcus kept his phone on him, the recording app ready to start at a moment's notice. He wasn't going to be caught off guard again. The officers hadn't shown up yet, but Marcus knew it was only a matter of time. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Marcus sat by the window, watching the road outside the cabin. He didn't say much to Tasha, but she could sense his unease. They were on edge, waiting for the next move, wondering how far these officers were willing to go. And then around midnight, Marcus saw the unmistakable flash of headlights pulling up to the cabin. He stood up, tension gripping his body as the familiar police cruiser came into view. The officers had returned, this time with a purpose. Marcus knew they weren't just there to ask questions, they were looking for a confrontation. And this time, Marcus was ready for them. The late-night silence was broken by the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. Marcus remained still by the window, his eyes locked on the police cruiser that had just pulled up. He watched as two officers, the same ones who had harassed them before, stepped out of the car. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were trying to decide how best to approach this situation. Tasha, who had been sitting on the couch, felt the shift in the atmosphere. She glanced toward the window, her heart sinking when she saw the familiar blue and red lights. "They're back," she whispered, her voice barely audible, fear threading through her words. Marcus nodded grimly. "Stay inside with the kids. I'll handle this." "Marcus, be careful," Tasha urged, standing up, her face tight with worry. "I will." Marcus's voice was steady, but underneath a current of anger simmered. He had given these officers a chance to walk away before. Now, they were forcing his hand. With a deep breath, Marcus stepped out onto the porch, his back straight, his face a mask of calm. The officers approached with the same air of authority they had displayed during their previous encounters, but Marcus could sense something different this time. They weren't just here to intimidate. They wanted a reaction. "Evening," one of the officers said, his voice laced with a forced politeness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "We'd like to ask you a few more questions if you don't mind." Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, meeting their gaze without flinching. "We've been through this already. You have no reason to be here." The second officer, the quieter of the two, stepped forward, his expression hardening. "We're investigating a series of crimes in this area, and we have reason to believe that you and your family might be involved." Marcus felt his patience thinning. They were pushing him, trying to provoke him into something they could use against him. He had seen this kind of manipulation before, officers goading suspects into reacting so they could justify their actions. But Marcus wasn't just any suspect. He was trained for this. and he wasn't about to let them bait him. "You have no evidence," Marcus said firmly, "and unless you have a warrant or concrete proof, you have no reason to be here." The first officer smirked, as if amused by Marcus's resistance. "Look, we're just doing our jobs. It'll go a lot smoother if you cooperate." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Cooperate? We've cooperated plenty. You've harassed my family twice now, with no reason other than your own assumptions." The officer's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "We're just trying to do what's best for the community. If you've got nothing to hide, there's no reason to be so defensive." Marcus took a step closer, his posture unwavering. "I'm not being defensive. I'm standing up for my family. You've made assumptions about us based on nothing but how we look, and that's not how law enforcement should operate." The second officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that this conversation wasn't going the way they had expected. But the first officer, the one who seemed more intent on confrontation, wasn't backing down. "We've got a job to do," the officer said, his voice tightening, "and we're not going to stop until we've done it." Marcus took a slow breath, his mind racing through his options. He could have ended this right then and there by showing them his FBI badge, revealing who he really was, but something inside him resisted. It wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about exposing what these officers were doing. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and Marcus wanted to see how far they would go if they thought they were in control. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said quietly, his voice low and steady. The first officer's eyes flickered with frustration. "Is that a threat?" Marcus didn't blink. "No, it's a warning. You're stepping into dangerous territory, and you don't even realize it." The tension between them crackled like static in the air. The officers exchanged a quick glance, but Marcus could tell they were still trying to assert their authority. Before they could say anything else, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up, his thumb hovering over the screen. "I've recorded every interaction we've had with you, everything you've said, everything you've done. I've got proof that you've harassed us without cause, and I'm ready to take this to the next level if you don't back off." The officers froze, their expressions shifting from smugness to unease. The first officer's bravado faltered as he realized what Marcus was saying. He hadn't expected this. A man who wasn't intimidated, a man who was prepared and ready to fight back in a way they couldn't anticipate. "What are you trying to do here?" The second officer finally spoke, his tone softer, more cautious now. "I'm trying to protect my family," Marcus replied, his voice sharp. "You've crossed the line, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. I've got the evidence, and I know exactly who to take it to." The officers exchanged another glance, but this time it was clear they were reconsidering their approach. The first officer's face reddened, but he didn't respond, his earlier confidence quickly evaporating. Marcus let the silence stretch for a moment, watching them squirm. He had dealt with men like this before, bullies who hid behind a badge, thinking they were untouchable. But now, the tables had turned. Marcus wasn't the one in danger anymore. They were. Finally, the first officer cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Look, maybe we've been a little too eager, but we're just trying to do our jobs. There's no need to escalate this." Marcus didn't move. "You already escalated it when you targeted my family based on nothing but prejudice. This isn't just about us. It's about the way you operate. And trust me, that's going to come back to haunt you." The second officer shifted uncomfortably again, clearly less eager for a confrontation now. "Maybe we've been overzealous," he admitted reluctantly, "but we're just trying to keep things safe." "If you really cared about safety," Marcus said sharply, "you'd focus on finding real criminals, not harassing innocent families. You need to rethink how you're doing your job." There was another long pause, and this time the officers seemed to understand that they were in over their heads. They had misjudged Marcus, misjudged his family, and now they were being called out for it. Finally, the first officer stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "All right, we'll leave you alone, but don't think this is over." Marcus gave a slight nod. "It's not over, but the next time we see each other, it'll be in a courtroom." The officers didn't respond. They simply turned and walked back to their cruiser, the tension still thick in the air as they drove away. Marcus stood on the porch for a few moments, watching them disappear into the darkness. When he finally turned and walked back inside, Tasha was standing by the door, her face a mix of relief and fear. "What did they say?" "They're backing off, for now," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. "But this isn't the end. They know they've been caught, but they'll be looking for a way to save face." Tasha exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe they had the nerve to come back." Marcus sat down, the adrenaline finally starting to wear off. "They thought they could intimidate us, but now they know they've messed with the wrong family." Tasha sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "What are we going to do now?" Marcus looked down at his phone, the recording still safely stored. "We're going to finish this. I'll take the evidence to the right people, and we'll make sure those officers are held accountable." Tasha nodded, her voice soft but determined. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Marcus promised, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "And when it is, they'll know they can't get away with this kind of behavior." As they sat together in the quiet of the cabin, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the officers had gotten off too easily. But he knew there was a bigger fight ahead. The evidence he had gathered wasn't just about protecting his family. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. The wheels of justice moved slowly, but Marcus was prepared to see this through to the end. The officers had misjudged him, blinded by their own prejudice, but now they would see the consequences of their actions unfold. The days that followed felt like a slow, tense crawl, with Marcus and Tasha on constant edge, waiting for the next move. The calm beauty of the lakeside resort was tainted by the stress of what had happened, and the idyllic vacation they had hoped for had dissolved into a silent battle for justice. Marcus, however, was determined to see this through. Early in the morning, while the kids were still sleeping, Marcus quietly sat at the small dining table with his laptop. He had already reviewed the recordings several times, ensuring that every detail was captured, every insult, every moment of suspicion, and every baseless accusation thrown at his family by the two officers. He made notes, adding them to his report. By now, Marcus's FBI colleagues were aware of the situation. He had reached out to his trusted contacts, providing them with all the evidence. They were shocked, not only by the officers' bad behavior, but by the fact that they had been reckless enough to harass an undercover FBI agent. Marcus had made it clear that while he wanted justice, he also wanted to ensure that this wasn't just about his own family. This was about accountability, about systemic change. Tasha joined him at the table, her eyes still heavy with the stress of the last few days. She sat quietly for a moment, watching Marcus work, before speaking softly. "Do you think it'll really make a difference, Marcus?" He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "I don't know, but we have to try. This can't just end here. If we let this go, it'll keep happening. Not just to us, but to other families who don't have the means to fight back." Tasha nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words. She reached across the table, resting her hand on his. "I'm proud of you. You've been so calm through all of this, so strong. I don't know how you do it." Marcus gave a small, tired smile. "I have to be. For you, for the kids, and for everyone who's been through this. I've seen too much in my career to just sit back and let this slide." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, their hands linked across the table. The weight of the situation hung between them, but there was also a sense of determination. They both knew this fight wasn't just about them. It was bigger than that. Later that afternoon, the phone call they had been waiting for finally came. Marcus picked up, recognizing the number immediately. It was his superior from the FBI. "Marcus," the voice on the other end said, his tone professional but edged with concern. "We've reviewed the evidence you sent us. It's pretty damning. The local police department has already been informed, and Internal Affairs is going to launch a full investigation into those officers." Marcus felt a wave of relief, but he kept his voice steady. "That's good to hear. But I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. These officers are part of a larger problem." His superior hesitated for a moment. "I understand. It's not going to be easy, but we'll make sure the right people are held accountable. You did the right thing by bringing this to us, Marcus." After ending the call, Marcus sat back, closing his eyes for a moment. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The investigation would take time, and there would likely be pushback from the local department. But Marcus had faith in the process, and more importantly, in the truth. He had done his part. Now, it was up to the system to do the rest. As the day wore on, Marcus and Tasha found themselves finally relaxing a little. The tension that had gripped them for days began to loosen its hold, and they spent time with Ava and Ely, trying to make the most of the remainder of their vacation. The kids, thankfully, hadn't fully understood the severity of what had happened. To them, the last few days had been strange and unsettling, but their parents had shielded them from the worst of it. In the evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an amber glow over the lake, Marcus took a walk with Ava and Eli along the shore. The children ran ahead, laughing as they skipped stones across the water, their earlier fears forgotten in the simplicity of the moment. Tasha joined them a few minutes later, slipping her arm through Marcus's as they watched their children play. "This is what matters," she said quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "No matter what happens, we have each other." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on Ava and Eli. "We'll get through this. And when we do, things will be different. I won't let this happen again, not to us, not to anyone." For the first time in days, Tasha smiled, genuinely smiled. "I know you won't." The days that followed brought more updates. The investigation into the officers began gaining momentum. News outlets started picking up the story, and soon the narrative expanded beyond their small vacation town. Reports of racial profiling and abuses of power within the local police department started surfacing, sparked by Marcus's decision to speak out. Public pressure mounted, and the officers involved were suspended, pending the outcome of the investigation. Despite the slow process of justice, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that their actions had made a difference. Marcus and Tasha kept their heads low, refusing media requests for interviews, choosing instead to let the evidence speak for itself. They didn't want fame. They wanted change. As the weeks passed, the ripple effect of their experience continued to spread. Other families came forward with their own stories of mistreatment by the local police, and soon the investigation expanded to encompass a wider pattern of misconduct. Marcus's decision to document everything had set in motion a series of events that exposed a system of prejudice and abuse that had long been hidden from view. One evening, back at home after their vacation, Marcus received another call. This time, it was from an attorney representing one of the families who had come forward. They wanted to thank Marcus for what he had done, for giving them the courage to stand up and share their own experiences. "You started something," the attorney said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Because of you, this isn't going to get brushed aside. Real changes are coming." Marcus hung up the phone, his chest tight with emotion. He had always known that his job was about more than just solving crimes. It was about justice, about making sure that the systems in place to protect people actually did their jobs. And now, in a way, he had become part of something even larger than his work at the FBI. As he sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Tasha joined him, sitting beside him with a quiet smile. "You did it," she said softly. "You made a difference." Marcus didn't respond right away, his mind filled with thoughts of the journey they had been on. The fear, the anger, the injustice, it had all led to this moment. He wrapped an arm around Tasha's shoulders, pulling her close as they sat in the fading light. "I didn't do it alone," he finally said, his voice quiet. "We did it together." Tasha leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "And it's not over yet, but we're stronger for it." The two of them sat in peaceful silence for a while, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky. The battle wasn't completely over, but there was a sense of resolution, of knowing that they had stood up against the wrongs they had faced and refused to back down. As the night deepened and the world around them grew quiet, Marcus felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. The journey had been difficult, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew that they had made a difference. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Justice was slow, but it was coming. And for the Jones family, that was enough. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.